Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium for Tuesday, September 28th, 2021. And delighted to see both familiar and some new faces with us today. Before introducing today's panel, today's speaker, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about next week's program. We will be hearing just let me get to my slide here. We have a panel discussion coming up to commemorate the 100th and 11th birthday of our namesake, Malcolm Renfrew, for whom this colloquium is named. And joining us next week will be a panel that consists of Dan Buckfitch, Janine Shreve, Michael O'Rourke, Ray Dacey, and Bob Steele, all who were either co-workers or friends of Malcolm over the years. This is in commemoration of his birthday, which happens on October 12th. Well, October 12th is our annual presentation in conjunction with the Bora Symposium. And so we have pushed our annual Renfrew commemoration forward, and we'll be doing that next week during the regular colloquium time, 12:30 to 1:30 on Tuesday. Today's topic, I think, is one that Malcolm himself would have been quite interested in, the connection between green energy and clean energy, the minerals that will power our low carbon future. Our speaker today is the executive director and an environmental scientist at TerraGraphics International Foundation, known as TIFO, a Moscow-based nonprofit that supports mining and recycling communities in addressing environmental health challenges. Casey Bartrem received her PhD in environmental science from the University of Idaho in 2017, and she mentors several U of I students who are doing research related to TIFO projects. She has worked on environmental health projects in Kyrgyzstan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and the United States in close collaboration with local stakeholders, government representatives, and humanitarian organizations. Her research interests include the impact of climate change on mineral demand and how climate change shifts subsistence agriculture communities to subsistence artisanal mining. So she is not a stranger, has been a speaker for this series before, and we're delighted to have you with us. So welcome, Casey.
Thank you very much, Kenton. I'm really thrilled to be joining you all today. This is one of my favorite events when I was a student at U of I, and I'm still really excited to be a part of it. So thank you for having me today. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen up for y'all. Okay, as Kenton said, my name is Casey Bartrem, and I'm with TIFO, a nonprofit organization that's based here in Moscow. And I'd like to draw attention first to my co-authors for the presentation who are listed on this slide. TIFO, as Kenton mentioned, works with mining communities around the world to support initiatives that address health issues that often result from mining and mineral recycling. And today what I'd like to talk about is how that relates to climate change. And we all know that we need to reduce carbon emissions, and to do that, it requires a shift to low carbon technology. But what's often missing from the conversations about that shift is the trade-offs that it presents. So what I'd like to do is look at how the demand for minerals used in batteries and solar panels and wind turbines is projected to increase, often by orders of magnitude within the next several decades. Many of the minerals powering these low carbon technologies, even here in the Pacific Northwest, are mined in low and middle income countries around the world, often with environmental and public health consequences that would be punishable under law were they to occur in the United States. And simultaneously, we're seeing new mining areas being developed right now in the US, even here in the Pacific Northwest, and often without consultation or consideration of community interest, especially indigenous communities that would be impacted. So today I'd like to look at that look at some of the minerals that will power this low carbon future, and see if we can start addressing what that might mean if we're going to make that low carbon transition both equitable and sustainable. Just a quick look at the flow of the presentation today. We're going to talk first about the migration of mining, just very briefly, and then look in more detail at climate change in mining, focusing more on lithium, copper, and cobalt as examples of this transition. And then we'll look more at impacts in in the Pacific Northwest, mostly in Idaho, and we'll end with some other considerations and then how we can move forward and leave some time for discussion at the end. Before we get into the details of the talk today, I'd like to just quickly introduce 3 interrelated topics. When we think of climate change, we often think of how it impacts natural disasters, infrastructure, agriculture, public health, all of these things. But climate change also closely relates to conflict. And this is something that the US Department of Defense has recognized for more than a decade. They refer to climate change as an accelerant of instability. That means it contributes to outbreaks of violent conflict around the world. We also know that mining and conflict are strongly related. And this has been described as a resource curse, which is the paradoxical relationship where a country has a high value natural resource, but is simultaneously plagued with violent wars or conflict or low development indicators. But today, what I'm going to focus on is the relationship between climate change and mining. I wanted to highlight that this is a wicked problem with highly complex interactions. And I think you'll see some of these other themes emerge during the talk today. We often use this quote by Thoreau when talking about mining, that the path of least resistance leads to crooked rivers and crooked men, because industry really does tend to also follow the path of least resistance. And over the course of several decades, we've seen this as the US has slowly improved our environmental and public health laws in order to be more protective of ecological health and of human health. Many countries saw an increase in mining as a result of mining companies moving overseas. At the time that we were increasing our protections here, there were countries that were moving to privatize their mining industries, and they were doing this often in order to qualify for loans from the World Bank or the IMF. So this opened up mining opportunities to private companies in places where they originally could not have operated. So we're seeing 2 issues happen almost simultaneously that pushes mining companies outside of the US and other high-income countries. And the result is that the companies end up in low and middle income countries with absent or poorly enforced environmental regulations and cheaper workforces. At the same time, the demand for metals has increased over time. So in the US, this means we end up with better environmental health and cheaper commodities. And to this day, there are no comprehensive international environmental laws to address this disconnect. So we can't regulate how minerals are extracted and where when they come in the form of finished products into the US. So as an example, we have strict laws here about the amount of lead that a smelter can release into the air and into the water. But when we purchase a car battery, we have no idea how that lead was mined or refined, and there are no laws to regulate that. To meet carbon targets, we need to shift away from fossil fuels. I hope everybody in this group today recognizes that. We are incredibly far behind in attempting this. We have our work cut out for us. And so we know that alternative energies are what we're looking towards. This includes solar and wind power. These are increasingly popular ways to avoid burning fossil fuels. And of course, that reduces our greenhouse gas emissions. These technologies and the batteries required to store their energy are resource intensive in themselves. There are environmental impacts associated with mining. This impacts wildlife, agriculture, the water we drink, the air we breathe, and even the food that we grow. And mining also makes a significant contribution to greenhouse gas emissions in and of itself. And of course, there are serious social justice and inequalities associated with how resources are mined in the world today and where that they are mined. So we know that it's important to reduce carbon emissions. And I want to be clear, I am not advocating for abandoning that effort. I am not against these low carbon technologies. But I think the first thing we need to do is change how we think about those technologies. And maybe we start by calling it something different. Maybe instead of saying green energy or even clean energy, we call it low carbon or alternative energies instead. And then we also need to critically examine mining. Where do the minerals come from? Who has been impacted by the extraction of those minerals? And who is benefiting from those minerals? And often who is impacted and who benefits are not the same group. So I'd like to get into some specific examples now. The World Bank in 2017 published a report called The Growing Role of Minerals and Metals for a Low Carbon Future. They have a bunch of resources about this report, some great infographics and videos. It's really worth checking out if you're interested in this topic. And I'm using a lot of figures from their report in some subsequent slides here. What the World Bank did is they modeled the growth of low carbon energy and calculated some of the minerals that would be required to meet those growth projections. So the image on the right has a lot happening in it, but I want to draw your attention to the top 3 lines. The first one is lithium. So in this graphic, you can see the World Bank is projecting that by the year 2050, we will need 965% more lithium than was produced in 2017 to meet global demand, 965%. By 2050, which is just less than 30 years away now, we need almost 600% more cobalt. We need almost 400% more graphite, and you can just go down the list. At the bottom corner of this, there's some information about copper demand. And copper is very necessary for technologies like wind and solar power. So I'll break that down in a moment, but I want to call out that fine print that we will need the same amount of copper in the next 25 years as we've used in the last 5,000 years. So now I'd like to go into this in a little more detail and talk about lithium, copper, and cobalt as examples. So remember, 965% more lithium in the next 30 years. We need that because lithium is a crucial component in lithium-ion batteries. This is the preferred way to store energy. These batteries also require other metals like aluminum and cobalt, which we'll talk about momentarily, and iron and manganese. And they're used in a variety of technology, not just low carbon technology, but also small electronics like the cell phones we all have sitting next to us at this very moment, electric vehicles, as well as large energy storage systems like those for wind and solar power. The reason that lithium is so important is because lithium-ion batteries pound for pound are some of the most energetic rechargeable batteries available. So they're lighter than other types of rechargeable batteries of the same size, and they have a very high energy density. And they can handle thousands of charge and discharge cycles, which also makes them very desirable. Now there's 2 forms of lithium deposits in the world. There's hard rock ores, which is what we probably think of when most people think of mining. And there's salt brines, and the salt brine is what I want to show you with this picture that's up on the slide. Depending on the type of deposit, the lithium is extracted very differently. So this particular photo is a salt brine deposit in South America. And at this location, miners will start by drilling a hole in the salt flats and pumping a salty, mineral-rich brine to the surface, and then leaving it there to evaporate for several months. From that point, there's a mixture of different types of salts, including lithium salts, and that gets filtered and further evaporated until lithium carbonate can be isolated and extracted. Now, this process is relatively cheap, very effective, but it uses an incredible amount of water. In fact, at this particular site, they estimate about 500,000 gallons of water are used per ton of lithium produced. Very water intensive. Much of the lithium that's mined in the world today, over 13,000 metric tons of it, comes from Australia. But if you look at this chart, South America, especially Chile and Argentina, have far more lithium in reserves than is currently produced in places like Australia. And the lithium industry, in fact, is growing rapidly in those countries. This is important for a couple reasons. In Australia and in China, most of the lithium occurs in hard rock ores, but when we talk about the Americas and South America in particular, most of the lithium occurs in brines, and most of the lithium occurs in highly arid environments. So when we talk about the amount of water used to produce lithium, it becomes a serious problem in places like the Atacama Desert, for example. I'd like to switch to copper now. Copper is absolutely critical to low carbon technology. And one example of this is how it's used in wind turbines. The image on the right is from that 2017 World Bank report. They predicted at that time that wind power would increase by 63% by the year 2023. So that's just in a short 6 to 7 year period. I don't know where we stand on this projection today. I wish I could tell you, but it's an incredible amount of increase in a very short time. Wind turbines range in size dramatically. They can go from 1.2 all the way up to 15 megawatts. And just to give you an idea of what that means, it's anywhere from 80 to 300 meters tall. So if we look at the smaller end of that spectrum, we look at a 3 megawatt turbine, it requires almost 5 tons of copper, 300 tons of steel, 12,000 tons of concrete, 2 tons of rare earth elements, and 3 tons of aluminum. So that's in one turbine. It's pretty incredible. And depending on turbine size, another way to break that down is that 1,000 to 3,000 kilograms of copper are required per megawatt of wind energy. When we look at copper deposits globally, they're pretty widespread around the world. Chile currently produces the bulk of the world's copper. In fact, the 10 largest copper mines, 6 of them exist in Chile, 2 in Mexico, and 1 in Peru, with the 10th being over in Indonesia. So most of the copper that's being produced today in those 10 largest mines is on the western edge of the Americas. Finally, cobalt. Cobalt's a critical component of lithium-ion batteries, especially in e-vehicles. Again, we need almost 600% more cobalt by the year 2050. And the global supply of cobalt is interesting. It fluctuates considerably, largely because most of it comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has been experiencing a lot of instability within the past decade. Depending on the year, anywhere from 55 to 85% of our global cobalt supply comes from the DRC. And I'll come back to the DRC momentarily. Cobalt reserves are spread out in other continents in addition to the African continent. So we see it in Australia, Asia, South America, and North America. I'll point out that the US is not highlighted on this map, but we're going to talk later about cobalt mining in the Pacific Northwest. A little more detail on cobalt in the DRC. As I said, 55 to 85% of our cobalt comes from this country, and the number varies due to the ongoing conflict in the country. And that conflict is related to cobalt extraction itself. So cobalt mining in DRC is directly linked by many experts to the ongoing violent conflict, to child labor, and to really horrific working conditions. And you'll remember that I earlier mentioned the relationship between mining and climate change and conflict. So the story about cobalt in the DRC really highlights this relationship in a heart-wrenching way. Most of the cobalt in the DRC comes from artisanal mining. Artisanal mining is small-scale mining. It's not one large company. It's individuals or loosely organized groups going out to mine for this ore. And artisanal mining occurs in a variety of forms around the world. I'll come to that next. There are efforts to formalize artisanal cobalt mining in the DRC and create responsible supply chains for it. In fact, Tesla is one of the companies that's taking the charge on this because they want to be able to ensure that their cobalt in their vehicles has come from responsible mines within the Democratic Republic of Congo. I had to have a slide on here about artisanal mining because it's a critically important source of jobs and minerals in the world today. And again, when I say artisanal mining, I mean mining carried out by individuals or groups, but not large-scale companies. It's really characterized by low technology. And so because of that, it's often done when mineral value is very high. So that includes gold, cobalt, and precious gems like diamonds. In fact, I think 80% of the sapphires in the world come from artisanal miners. And that's because the recovery rates are quite low when compared to industrial scale mines. And so it has to be a high value ore in order for the artisanal miners to make a profit. If you haven't heard about this industry, you really need to know about it. It results in massive amounts of environmental impact, deforestation, and really serious occupational and public health risks. It's also the source of 20% of our gold in the world and up to 80% of our cobalt, depending on the year. It's also a critical source of income for more than 100 million people around the world, and that number increases every day because ASM is ultimately a poverty-driven activity. It's driven by economic forces, it's driven by metal prices, and it's driven by climate change. Not only does climate change drive mining by increasing the demand for low carbon technology, it's also driving people to shift away from subsistence livelihoods because livelihoods like farming and herding are becoming increasingly difficult in regions where we see erratic rainfall, like in the Sahel region of Africa, and severe flooding like we see in many parts of the world, including Southeast Asia. So people in those regions are increasingly turning to alternative sources of income, and artisanal mining is one of them. Shifting a little bit, still looking at the relationship between mining and climate change. This relationship is impacting US communities as well. So just this year, the Biden administration announced a plan to address supply chain disruptions. And many of these, as you can imagine, were related to COVID-19. But there were also specific targets for minerals for low carbon technology. And specifically, the administration announced they're investing in the expansion of the largest rare earth element mining and processing site outside of China. They want to have that here in the United States to provide raw materials necessary to combat the climate crisis. That's kind of a paraphrase from the executive order. Shortly after this press release, the National Mining Association, you can imagine, applauded Biden's executive order on the supply chains, specifically for targeting domestic mineral supply, because they saw that, of course, as a potential for increased mining back within the United States. And just in case you thought this was a partisan issue, it's not. In 2017, President Trump signed an executive order to secure the supply of minerals used for cell phones, computers, automobiles, planes, and other products critical to our economic security. And this White House press release does not mention climate change. I don't think that will surprise many people. But other government websites cited the importance of these commodities to ensuring renewable energy infrastructure, including solar, wind, and batteries. So they cited 35 critical minerals, most of which are crucial for low carbon technology, and many of them appear on the World Bank report list as well. And lithium and cobalt are on that list. So we've talked about international mining to power this low carbon technology and about the national development of mineral resources. I'd like to look next at the Pacific Northwest. We'll look at 3 locations in particular. We're going to look at a cobalt mine in Salmon, Idaho, and then 2 proposed mines, one an antimony facility near McCall, Idaho, and one proposed lithium mine in northern Nevada, right up at the Oregon border at Thacker Pass. You'll remember I said that cobalt is a key component of lithium batteries and e-vehicles. We've seen an incredible increase in claims in the cobalt belt of Idaho in the last year. In fact, in 2018 alone, the Bureau of Land Management saw 6,000 new mining claims in Idaho, 5,000 of which were in the Idaho Cobalt Belt, so just in that region that's shaded on this map. The Idaho Cobalt operation, it used to be called the Idaho Cobalt Project, but they changed the name, is the only permitted cobalt mine in the US today. It's expected to produce nearly 32 million pounds of cobalt once it becomes fully operational, which is expected to happen mid-2022. It's already fully permitted and coming online. At today's metals prices, that will produce about $65 million in cobalt over the projected life of the mine, which is roughly 12 and a half years. So this again is right on the Idaho-Montana border. The next mine is a proposed mine. It's called the Stignite Mine, if anyone's heard of that. It's an antimony mine proposed in central Idaho, east of McCall. And it's actually on the headwaters of the South Fork of the Salmon River. So for those of you familiar with the Salmon watershed, this is on the headwaters of the South Fork. The mining company is proposing extraction of gold from existing mining waste that's already at this site, and they will do that using cyanide extraction. But antimony is also a key production target at this Stignite mine. And Stignite is interesting. Antimony is traditionally used as a flame retardant in toys and aircraft and consumer products, but it's become a critical mineral for solar panels, batteries, and phones as well. There are other efforts underway to mass produce large liquid storage batteries that use antimony. So instead of just having lithium batteries or other metals, there's a battery company that's actually owned by Bill Gates that just announced plans to invest in technology for producing large-scale energy storage using antimony instead. So this is really on everybody's radar as one of the minerals needed to combat the climate crisis. Just to speak specifically to the Stignite Mine in McCall, some of our board members have been intimately involved in reviewing the environmental impact statement that was released by the government. And they and dozens of experts really found a lot of concerning flaws with the EIS. There was a significant risk of human health impacts that really weren't addressed. There's significant risk of harm to tribes, which have not been consulted to this day, harm to salmon, water pollution, and none of these were addressed in the EIS. So that's now been back, it's now back with the agencies after everybody's had a chance to comment. And this mine is still up in the air. We don't really know what's going to happen. Something to keep an eye on. This infographic is interesting. It was produced by Perpetua Resources, and Midas Perpetua is the company proposing the Stignite Mine in McCall. And what they're showing is that antimony really is a critical mineral for US economic and national security, which is something that the Trump administration noted in their executive order in 2017. The interesting thing about antimony, as I mentioned before, is that it's always been used for flame retardant properties, especially in consumer products. But now we're seeing this shift toward looking at it as a potential for low carbon technology, including the development of large scale energy storage batteries that rely on antimony instead of lithium. And this article from Mining News, which came out just last month, highlights that antimony's use has really shifted or may shift in the future. Finally, I'd like to look at the Thacker Pass mine. This is a proposed lithium mine. It's located about 50 miles from the Fort McDermott Paiute Shoshone Reservation, right in northern Nevada. The mine would be on sacred land to that Fort McDermott tribe. The company proposing this mine estimates the operation would increase US lithium production by up to 10 times. They also estimate that they would need to pump 3,000 gallons of water per minute in order to operate. And this is important for several reasons. For those of you who haven't been to northern Nevada, it's very dry. In fact, the US Bureau of Reclamation is considering making the federal government's first ever official water shortage declaration for a state in Nevada. And this would prompt water consumption cuts in the state, which would greatly impact ranchers and other residents of the state, of course, but it would have even greater impact if there's a mine pumping 3,000 gallons of water a minute. So the mining company is acknowledging that the local springs that the ranchers use are likely to be impacted and that they may never return to full production even after the mine has closed. Also of note is that the operation will probably produce up to 150,000 tons of carbon dioxide each year. Local and regional tribes and ranchers have filed lawsuits against this proposed mine and asked for injunctions on mine development. I do know that one of the tribal injunctions was declined in the Nevada state courts, so we'll see what happens with the other filings. And just to kind of step back a little bit, this came across my newsfeed recently, so I wanted to include it. The BLM just approved exploratory drilling in the Arizona Big Sandy River Valley. This is a sacred area for the Wallapai tribe. And according to this news article from High Country News, and again, it just came out recently, the tribe was not allowed to participate in the planning processes, and they are seeking legal recourse. So the interesting thing is this photo here is actually of somebody at the Fort McDermott Thacker Pass site, and the article cites both as regions where Indigenous communities are being impacted but not consulted about lithium mining. So I'd like to talk now and leave a good amount of time for discussion about where we can go from here. I hope that I've made the case that low carbon does not mean low impact. They are not the same thing. They're not exchangeable. I'd also like to point out that what might already be obvious, mining companies do not tend to self-regulate. They are for-profit industries and they are accountable to their shareholders. They need to maximize profits. And so governments and citizens, to an extent, need to regulate these companies carefully so that we can ensure that they act in an environmentally and a socially responsible manner. So we need to enforce and strengthen domestic regulations. And we need to take a serious look at international regulations. Like I said, we don't really have any international environmental laws to speak of. And in doing that, we can aim to develop responsible and transparent supply chains for the minerals that we consume now and that we will continue to consume for this low carbon revolution. I've talked entirely about mining today. And this was actually a major criticism of the World Bank report that I've been citing, because it doesn't mention any development of recycling systems to reduce primary mining. And this is a really important point. If we could develop these recycling systems and the supply chains for them and the technologies for them, along with our low carbon technology, we could really reduce the amount of new minerals that we have to be mining before we even really get going on this. So the supply chains and the development of that recycling technology is a critical piece of making this industry a lot more sustainable. What we as TIFO have learned in working on projects in mining communities is that all actors are needed in order to move forward in a meaningful way. This includes consumers, scientists, media, as well as policymakers, miners and mining companies themselves, whether that's artisanal miners or industrial scale, and the communities, especially, as well as the government. So everybody really needs to take an active role and needs to be involved in decision-making for these efforts. Finally, the true cost of mining needs to be paid by everyone, not just the mining communities who often end up paying the big price, and certainly not our indigenous communities. Our artisanal miners are often risking their lives to make enough money to feed their families. They're often the ones paying a very high price in order to make a little bit of money to feed their families. We know that industry can afford to mine responsibly. They may often argue that profit margins are too small, but we recognize and analyses have shown that that's completely untrue. We know that they need to be forced, whether it's by the government or by consumers or both, to do this more responsibly, even if it means narrowing some profit margins. And of course, consumers need to take some responsibility as well. Some of these costs might be passed on to consumers, and that's something that we have to just grapple with. I also want to talk a little bit about individual actions. So this term is really interesting to me, the planned obsolescence, or the intentional downgrading of electronic devices over time by releasing newer, slightly more appealing versions of that same product. So phone companies are really famous for doing this. There's always a new and better phone coming out, and it's just a little bit different, and it has a few more features that are really appealing. And what this means is over time, even though it's more appealing, it may not necessarily function a whole lot better. We tend to replace our products at a faster rate than maybe we need to. So this drive to have the latest and greatest phone or laptop or whatever it is results in more than 50 million tons of e-waste, electronic waste, each year, possibly more. It's really hard to estimate what e-waste productions are, but that's one of the estimates, is it's up to or exceeding 50 million tons every year. So as individuals, one thing that we can do is when we're thinking about that upgrade, which I'm sure many people in this Zoom room right now are, remember that most of the CO2 emissions associated with your device come from mining the materials that go into it. So once you have that device, the longer you can make it last, the better, because then you're extending the amount of time that you get use out of those emissions that have already happened. If you're interested in finding devices and learning about this particular piece of the issue, Somebody just shared an article with me that I found really helpful, and they do suggest some devices that are designed so you can replace components on them, like the battery, which is always my big gripe about my phone, is that my battery just doesn't last more than a couple years. There are devices out there that are designed so that you can replace those things over time instead of having to buy a new phone because the battery is no longer taking a charge. So this is an article from The Guardian, and it's got some great resources in it, and it's a good starting place for folks who want to just kind of get their toes wet in this issue. And finally, I want to end by paraphrasing Josh Ritter, who is a famous Moscovite. Many of you will have heard of him or know of him. And he recently published a fiction book written from the perspective of an old logger. And it's really a wonderful read. That doesn't really seem to be related to this, except at one point in the book, the logger goes on a diatribe about how everything seems to have a button. And I really thought about that when I was putting together this presentation. And maybe that means we can reassess whether everything in our lives needs to be electronic. Now, when it comes to accessibility, of course, that's a wonderful tool, and it's great to have that. And I'm not negating that in any way, but from wine openers to toothbrushes to the remote controls on window blinds, if we don't need that technology, maybe we can find a balance between doing things a little bit more the old-fashioned way when it comes to some of our devices in our lives. So that's just something to think about. And again, I'm not speaking towards the accessibility part of it, because that's obviously a wonderful thing. So I think I've left a good chunk of time for discussion. I tried to rush through a little bit. I'm really grateful for all of you joining today. I put my contact here if you would like to follow up or ask questions or reach out. We do work with a lot of students and universities, U of I and others, so please feel free to reach out. And I'll just end by saying that this photo I'm showing is from an artisanal gold mining community that we worked with in Nigeria. In this region, in particular, we're seeing the impacts and interactions of climate change, mining, and conflict, that image that I showed you earlier. In fact, these communities that we've been working in for 11 years are being severely impacted by recent violence, and it's related to climate change. And a lot of experts are recognizing that. And so despite the fact that that's happened, we've also seen some incredible successes in this project, even to this day. And so I think we often get stuck on the doom and gloom, and people feel like, especially with this presentation, they can't do right with climate change and low carbon technology. And I don't want to leave people with that impression, because these problems are incredibly difficult, but they're not impossible. And there are ways to move forward responsibly, just as long as we have the full picture of what we're getting into when we think with it, we're doing well by buying an e-vehicle or solar panels or that kind of thing. So just something to kind of start thinking about as we move forward in our lives. So with that, I think we have some time for questions. You take over.
Casey, thank you for that informative and provocative presentation. And in our household, we're struggling with a cell phone that won't hold a charge, and wondering whether another brand might be an alternative. So thanks for sharing that Guardian article. And we've got about 20 minutes. And so I would invite everyone in the audience, if you have a question, you can go ahead and use the raise hand function in Zoom, or if you want to put a question into chat as well, and I'm glad to offer that. And while we're waiting for our live participants to join in, I wondered if I can forward a question from Nancy Cheney, who is a regular attendee at these programs and couldn't be with us today. You did touch on the challenges of lithium, particularly on the mining and reclamation. And Nancy asks, we've heard about pending improvements to battery technology for years. What are the most promising and realistic alternatives to lithium for the near future? And do any of these alternatives present some opportunities for research and development here at the University of Idaho or in Moscow?
That's a great question. I think the antimony battery is interesting. I think any alternative is going to come with trade-offs. So that's the first thing we have to recognize. The thing with lithium is we don't really know how to recycle lithium batteries right now. And so if there was a way to look at recycling for an alternative battery, that would be something that would be more interesting to me as a viable alternative, because then we would be able to more effectively say, there's less mining that has to be done. So that would be one thing just to think of off the top of my head is, and specifically which metals. I'd have to do a little more research, but the antimony battery is an interesting one. I don't know that it is or isn't better. But yeah, in terms of research, it would be good to know which one we can go after that has some recycling options, because lithium right now, we just don't know that much about how we could do that.
We have a question from Jan Bull at Washington State University, and he's asking, when electronics are taken to be recycled, do you know if the rare materials within them are being removed for reuse?
This is a great question. I didn't talk about rare earth metals specifically in this presentation, but that is something that's needed specifically for low carbon technology, but all sorts of technologies, including all of our phones. In the screens that you're looking at right now, there's some rare earth elements in the screens you're all staring at. So it's a great question. Rare earth elements occur in the Earth's crust around the world in very small concentrations. That's how they get their name. There's some of those hard to pronounce elements that are on our periodic table. In terms of electronics being recycled, some of them certainly are recycled for copper and other materials that can be more readily extracted. But to my knowledge, I don't think there's much for the rare earth materials that are contained in that. Now, you probably shouldn't quote me on that because it's a great question. But e-waste recycling does come with a lot of issues still because it's not very well regulated. And so most of it is done in manners that have a lot of occupational and environmental health impacts. So even though we feel good when we take our cell phone to the Moscow Recycling Center to the e-waste, and we know that that's going to go be recycled somewhere, and that's a good first step, we don't know if it's going to be done responsibly, if it's not going to involve child labor, that kind of thing. So just some more things, I guess, to think about, Jan. Thanks for your question.
We have a question in chat from Sophia, and she asks, how realistic is it to regulate artisanal mining on a global scale? And are there ways to transition local economies that depend on this type of mining to a different way of making a living? And I know that the TIFO has been involved with some of these activities, especially in Africa, but maybe you could talk broadly about efforts to regulate this globally.
It's a great question, Sophia. There are efforts in the private sector to develop responsible mineral supply chains, especially for the jewelry sector. So just like you can get conflict-free diamonds, there are efforts to get what's called green gold, gold that's mined in a way by artisanal miners specifically, that's mined in a way where there was some effort for reforestation after the mine closed, where the miners avoided using mercury, which is one of the big concerns with artisanal gold mining, is the release of mercury use. So there are these private efforts, these responsible supply chains that jewelers are now trying to go after. In terms of the realistic nature of regulating it on a global scale, it really would probably have to come from some of the big gold, the hubs is what I'm looking for, the hubs in certain parts of the world, including the UAE. And they would probably have to, because that's where a lot of the artisanal gold ends up, at least from Africa, it ends up in the UAE. And so that would have to be a hub that some of the regulation would have to start there in terms of figuring out where the gold came from and trying to certify it that way. It's a challenge for sure.
And one of the alternatives to battery-powered vehicles might be the hydrogen car or truck. And so I have a question from Tanya. Do hydrogen-powered vehicles have as many hidden environmental costs as those powered by electric batteries? And would we be trading one problem for another if we switch to hydrogen vehicles in the next couple of decades?
That's a great question, Tanya. And this is the problem with giving this presentation is I don't have a lot of knowledge about some of these very new technologies, including hydrogen vehicles. So I wouldn't feel comfortable answering that either way, which is a shame. I wish I could. I would imagine there's still trade-offs. There must be, but it's one I'm going to have to look into.
So other questions, I'm not seeing any in chat, but if anyone would care to put up a hand there, Bob, yes, please, if you want to go and ahead and unmute yourself and ask away.
Sure. I'm glad you brought up the issue of obsolescence, and some of that is not just because feature creep, but because they design things to die, so you have to buy another one.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on either industry standards or government regulation to address these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question and a great point. That's that the planned obsolescence is not, there is some intentionality to it for sure. And without getting into the debate of whether it should be done in the private sector and let the market handle it or the public sector and have the government handle it, I think both are really important approaches. You know, as consumers, we can start demanding this, but that often takes, it takes some time and some work. And of course, government regulations are the same, but having those kinds of standards, like the phone that I mentioned, that where you can replace parts, you know, having that available and making that more accessible. It would be great if you didn't void the warranty on your iPhone by taking it apart to try and change the battery, which in this particular article, the author makes a pretty funny comment about trying to do that and needing to go lie down in a dark room afterwards. But it would be nice if as consumers, we could just take something apart and replace the part. And that shouldn't be such a big issue. And that's, it seems silly when you think about it, that's what we've come to.
So good question, Bob. And I did put into the chat a link to that Guardian article that may have been a little hard to pick up from the PowerPoint.
Thank you.
So, other questions? I know we've got lots of global environmental experts in the room today. So feel free to make a comment or respond, or maybe make your own policy suggestion about what we should be doing about this global challenge as we try to move to a carbon-free economy and a carbon-free environment.
I'd be interested just with like a show of hands, maybe if people would just indicate, you know, if this is a new thought or idea, this idea that low carbon energy is not the panacea that we thought it was. Is this something that most people are somewhat familiar with, or is this something that was a little bit out of left field? So I guess, yeah, thumbs up or a raised hand if you've thought about this or heard about this before. Let's see if I can switch my view here. So I only see like 6 or 7, a couple more hands. Yeah, it's interesting to me. Sometimes when we have these conversations with folks, they get kind of defensive about it, you know, that green energy is the only way that we're going to get out of this climate mess. And you know, it's absolutely true that we need to be doing this. But I think once we get over the initial shock of like, oh, my Tesla isn't the answer to the problem, then we can start having some real conversations about how we move forward. But it's a great point.
Casey, are any of the national environmental groups, World Wildlife Federation or Sierra Club, or the global climate action groups talking about this as a policy initiative, or has the focus been so much on trying to get our carbon consumption down that we haven't paid enough attention to alternatives?
I haven't seen a lot of discussion of it, and it's something I think about. Like, we have a sign in front of our office, Moscow is ready for 100% clean energy. And every time I come to the office in the morning, I see that sign and I think about that. Even if it was the climate advocacy groups that were starting to say, we want clean energy and we want to understand some elements of the supply chain for that energy, and we want to understand X, Y, or Z, just having some first steps towards responsible minerals that are involved in that. There is a group, and I'm not going to remember the name, but if Margaret's on, she will, because she's been working on it. But the IRMA work, Margaret, if you're still listening, that's being done by, I can't think of the name of the group. She must have stepped away from her computer. There's an NGO in the West that's looking at developing a list of standards for responsible mining. And this climate change issue and climate mining has been a part of the impetus for that. So there are some NGOs that are starting to push the envelope on it, which is really exciting. But I haven't seen groups like Sierra Club or some of the others pick it up. Margaret, what's the name of that group?
It's called IRMA, and it's a consortium of environmental conservation groups, industries, legal organizations, mining groups, and they're trying to develop national standards. And so, of course, everybody's having to give a little bit, but I think it's the way to start. It's a good start, and it's the way those kinds of things need to come together. Oh, let's see.
I'm getting the URL right now. Thank you.
Yeah, I found that in a quick search for responsible mining.
Yeah, so those are the kind of initiatives that I think can help get all the people at the table that need to be talking to each other.
Yeah, and that would be a great way to kind of funnel some of the other groups to starting to have those conversations, some of those other bigger groups that you mentioned, Kenton.
In the few minutes that are left, Casey, I wonder if you could give us an update on a couple of the other TIFO projects that you have presented to this colloquium before. I'm especially interested in what's happening in Kyrgyzstan and what's happening in, is it Nigeria and in West Africa?
Yeah, it's for everybody, it's been a bit of a weird couple years. So we haven't traveled to any of our projects for almost exactly 2 years now. November 2019 is the last time I was in Kyrgyzstan. And so it's been a bit of a challenge, but we've made some great progress despite that. And we hope to be able to start traveling again this winter, knock on wood. So in Nigeria, it's an interesting time in the project because Doctors Without Borders is closing their treatment program for lead poisoning. And so we're looking at developing the handover to the local ministries, specifically in Zamfara State. I know one of our colleagues is actually on this call right now. We're working with him and Doctors Without Borders on that right now. And it involves writing what they're calling a lessons learned document, which is a really interesting exercise to reflect on an 11-year project and say what worked and what didn't work and why, and how do we make this sustainable in the long term. So that's been a really interesting exercise for us, and we fully intend on staying as involved as we can in Nigeria after MSF closes their treatment there. But it has become increasingly difficult to access the villages that we once worked in because of violence in the region. I mentioned that climate change is driving a lot of that ethnic violence. So that's one of the reasons that we're having to make this transition. Kyrgyzstan, the project is going well. That project will probably transition to us partnering just with the Ministry of Health in the coming years. MSF will also close their treatment program there. So we're excited to see about pursuing some options with our partners in country. We've got some really exciting student proposals to continue doing work in Kyrgyzstan. So that's really exciting. And we've started a new project in Southern Idaho, which we're really excited about. With the Duck Valley Indian Reservation, just one of the sister reservations actually to the one impacted by the Thacker Pass mine. So right down on the Idaho-Nevada border. And we're working on an environmental education project down there with middle school and high school students and looking at a kind of a full riparian ecosystem health project. So students are getting a chance to learn how water quality from upstream mining tailings and having beavers in the rivers and having dams downstream all are related to each other. And that's been a really fun project. We're acting in a supporting role to a couple of teachers and tribal members down in Duck Valley. And we got to go down there in July and do a bunch of beaver trapping and water quality testing and relocate some beavers into some upstream sections of these rivers. So that's been a really fun project for us as well. And the last thing that we're really excited about is we have a brand new student networking and professional development group. And so we have students from Kyrgyzstan, South Africa, and the US all getting together. Our first meeting is actually tonight. We have to meet at kind of funny times, as you might imagine, but they're all getting together to share research and form new collaborations and do professional development and all of these things. So we're really excited about doing that. It's a virtual thing that we sort of started during the epidemic, early stages of the epidemic, and we decided to make it an official thing. So that's been a lot of fun for Margaret and I specifically to get together.
The Duck Valley project sounds like a future Renfrew colloquium presentation. And
it would make a great one. And we've got, there's a U of I student from Duck Valley who is involved, of course, in the work. Probably more, there's more than one U of I student from Duck Valley, but one in particular who's been involved in the project. And so she would, maybe I can convince her to give a presentation on the project once it gets up and running.
Well, let's keep that in mind when we start our planning for the spring calendar of this series. And I know we're starting to lose people for 1:30 meetings or classes. So if I could ask the audience if you wouldn't mind turning on your cameras and giving our speaker a round of applause, or just putting hands up in the Zoom window and show your appreciation for, I think, a good topic that we need to learn more about.
Great. Well, thank you all. And thank you, Kenton. This was a lot of fun, and always look forward to this group. So I appreciate it.
And then before we formally adjourn, I did find my missing PowerPoint, and I can share the slide for next week's program. And just a reminder that we'll have an outstanding panel to tell us about Malcolm Renfrew, the namesake of this colloquium. And that picture was taken at the colloquium in the Whitewater room of the then Idaho Commons on Malcolm's 100th birthday, October 12th of 2010. And so this is a chance to learn a little bit more about his life and legacy. So hope everyone will come back for that program. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and hope to see you next week and on subsequent weeks. Bye for now.